Our story begins with a person running, and it was none other than our protagonist, who declared that he arrived late. At that moment, two people noticed that he had arrived. Kim Do-hwan began to complain immediately for the delay, however Kim Jin pointed out that he also used to arrive late. After arriving, the protagonist apologized for the delay, and here are some details about him. He is a rank D support and his name is Injanio. Continuing, Kim Do-hwan stated that he was just kidding, while Kim Jin explained that Chanwoo and Doon were already inside. However, our protagonist admitted that things were not going well. It had been 3 months since he joined that guild, and in his first incursion into a dungeon he was already late. As they approached the portal, the protagonist thought he should regroup. Since this was his first incursion into a dungeon as a support, he also felt the need to show that he was useful. At that moment, someone arrived. It was none other than Moon Do-hwan, who asked if it was his first dungeon. The protagonist confirmed by explaining that it was his first time as a support, however he had already been in a dungeon previously as an assistant. Do-hwan then explained that supports do not have combat skills like hunters, so he had to be careful. In addition, there was a risk of being dragged into the fight if he got too close. If he stayed too far, they could not defend him, so keeping a good distance was essential. He clarified that as a creator, he only needed to stay at a safe distance, and make a dagger for him when he was pointed out. Then Moon Do-hwan asked if he understood, to which the protagonist replied if that was all he needed to do, to which Moon Do-hwan agreed, since he was the only one who needed additional weapons. He explained that it was an easy dungeon, so there was no need to overload. However, Lehen commented that he could perceive mana, which meant that there was a monster nearby. At that time, his group began to prepare for the battle following his training. Moon Do-hwan asked Link if he had any observations, and he reported having detected 3 small mana sources, and 1 large enough to be a boss. Upon hearing this, Moon Do-hwan found it strange, since a boss normally does not leave his designated area. Then he stated that he would take care of the boss while the others took care of the rest. Then Moon Do-hwan asked how long it would take to create a dagger, and the protagonist replied that it would take 20 seconds, but it would only last less than a minute. However, Moon Do-hwan considered that it was ideal and instructed the protagonist to start making them immediately, declaring that he would finish the fight in 40 seconds. At that moment, classified crystal lizards appeared as of difficulty rank 5. Do-hwan declared that he was starting to activate his ability. He sent the lizards flying. King Jin advanced, prepared his fist and hit a lizard. After landing the blow, he quickly moved away, adopting an elegant pose. However, the other crystal lizards advanced. King Jin was surprised to see how fast they regenerated and asked everyone to be careful, as 2 were heading towards her. King Do-hwan then asked about the spell, and Link confirmed that he was almost ready. A moment later, Link cast his spell, shooting multiple fireballs that caused a huge explosion. Link confirmed that everything was fine, and King Do-hwan then ordered them to assist. Meanwhile, the protagonist observed everything and commented that it was an excellent sequence of attacks. However, Moon Do-hwan asked about the weapons. The protagonist confirmed that they were almost ready, reminding himself that he should not be distracted, and that he should concentrate. After a short time, our protagonist used his basic creator skill, a rank F creation, using mana to forge objects. At that moment, the protagonist threw a sword at Moon Do-hwan. He caught her quickly, and used his shadow weapon skill of rank A to improve her, improving her general quality. Meanwhile, the crystal lizard threw himself at him, and effortlessly stabbed the monster. After that attack, the creation of the protagonist disappeared. King Do-hwan asked if anyone was hurt, and King Jin confirmed that he was fine. Seeing all this, the protagonist admitted that it was a much better guild than he expected. In addition, each of them was remarkable. His teamwork avoided any mistakes in the battle. He concluded that if they continued like this, they would become a great guild. However, on the other hand, he stated that he had not done anything, except create the dagger. Outside of that, he was not very useful. He even questioned whether he deserved to be with them. But then Moon Do-hwan approached and asked him if the protagonist was hurt. He stated that he was not, however he explained that he had not been truly useful. Despite this, Moon Do-hwan told him that he had saved a lot of money thanks to his skill, since as he had seen before, his skill consumed weapons. He could not continue doing that, even if he used a cheap dagger. That is why he needed a creator like the protagonist, since his skill worked with any weapon that had mana. Then he once again stated that he had done a good job on his first mission in the dungeon. He told him to move on and not to move away from them, to which he replied that he would give his best. At that moment, Kim Do-hwan stated that they had to pick up the loot and leave. However, the whole atmosphere trembled. Kim Jin even wondered if an earthquake was occurring, and Link asked if the cave was collapsing because they had killed the boss. But pointing with the finger, the protagonist asked them to look over there. He explained that the wall was crumbling. However, Link cast a spell on his staff and explained that there was something similar to a passage and stated that it must be connected to some place. While Moon Duichuan did not think, Kim Duichuan could not stay still and stated that it was a secret passage. He also explained that there was probably a hidden treasure and he had to go. Kim Jin also agreed with this. However, Link stated that they could not enter, but then Moon Duichuan asked if Link could detect something, to which he replied that no. With that, Moon Duichuan did not see any problem and asked them to be quick. Seeing the situation, Link also agreed to go. Then Moon Duichuan called our protagonist. However, a moment after entering, our protagonist was running from a monster. He explained that everyone was dead except him. He said that a monster like that should not be in a ranged dungeon. I had never heard of a monster that could not be detected by magic. On returning, the protagonist realized that the monster had caught up with him. Then the monster hit him, sending him flying. He fell to the ground, coughing blood. The protagonist declared that he needed to get up because he could not die that way. Then he conjured something, created a dagger and threw it at the monster, but it had no effect, and the monster attacked fiercely. He broke the ground, causing him to fall. As he fell, the protagonist felt anxious about the situation. He declared that he was a useless support of rank D, unable to use simple things such as healing or reinforcement skills. In addition, when he had finally found a guild that really needed him, he abandoned them just to be killed anyway. He explained that anyone in his place would have done it better. At that moment, he declared that he should never have woken up. However, the system notified him that he had found something, but it was censored. In addition, he had met the requirements to become a player. When he opened his eyes, a strong light appeared, and so the system welcomed him. After a while, our protagonist opened his eyes, and the system declared that there was a new reward for him. However, our protagonist did not understand anything. Although he did not understand what was happening, he opened his hand and pressed the system button. Sometime later, our protagonist returned to the place where he had fallen. Meanwhile, the crystal gong roared. However, the system announced that the reward distribution had ended. Then our protagonist threw several swords at the monster, causing it to fall to the ground. On the other hand, our protagonist was submerged in his thoughts, since unknown memories had been placed in his mind, but without time to think much, the monster advanced towards him again. In the last second, our protagonist managed to conjure some kind of barrier. The protagonist was surprised to see that the monster had not been damaged. Despite being a golem-type monster, it had formidable durability. After his barrier was destroyed, the protagonist declared that if the information of those memories was correct, even if the monster was golem-type, its weak points and tactics to defeat it would remain the same. The supposed golem-type monster did not have specific weak points. Even if it received damage, it possessed an ability that allowed it to regenerate. As this was the case, it would need to inflict damage from multiple angles at the same time, and since he was a user based on skills in his core, he needed to materialize a grid and array of equal distance. This was because the creations made within the grid could move freely according to the user's will. So our protagonist conjured multiple skills and attacked the monster, which caused him to suffer great damage. As the smoke dissipated, the monster appeared completely destroyed. The protagonist stated that he initially saw the special ability of the grid as only a support ability that helped his creations move faster. However, as the skill increased, it could also be used as an offensive ability. At that time, the system notified that the boss had been defeated. However, both the name of the boss and that of the dungeon were censored. This obviously surprised him, since he could not see any information about the monsters or the dungeon, but in front of him, something seemed to be forming. The system then notified that the passive magic absorption ability had been activated. Upon seeing him, the protagonist wondered what that was. Then he began to reflect on what had just happened. Memories of his previous game. Although he did not know exactly what it was, there was something that he was sure of. It was definitely him, and to be more specific, it was a few years in the future. In that future, the entire world had collapsed, horrible things had happened. In addition, he had absorbed all the experience and knowledge of that time, and although it was the future, it was probably not the future of the world in which he was currently. In addition, too many things did not fit for that to be happening now, like the window of state in front of him, something that he had never been able to understand even in his past life. Seeing all this, the protagonist wondered if he had finally become a player. The term player was used for those who were chosen and awakened, and according to him, at that time players did not exist in this world. However, about 2 years ago, a small number of awakened individuals were chosen to become players. With this, a visible blue screen appeared only for those who were chosen. However, in the future, a mysterious thing called the system, something that seemed like a joke, was enough to shock everyone. After all, the system was not the only thing that was granted to players. Each player received different things, such as strength and unique skills. These two things simply appeared out of nowhere, however the players used them and experienced explosive growth compared to other awakened individuals. And thanks to the leader, who was chosen as a player, the guild to which he belonged could develop and become the first-class guild. Although he had no direct connection with him, he had to remain confident because he had perfected his skills and worked harder and harder. He declared that now he could check the skills he had learned through the system, although he had always thought it was something impractical. However, after thinking for a moment, he realized that he had never had a skill triggered by a dead golem. In addition, he had never heard of that from any other player. He accumulated contaminated mana energy, so he declared that now he understood how to obtain that magic. However, he would think about it later, because for now his priority was to take care of his body. The scene changed to the headquarters of the Hunter Association. A woman asked if she was sure that he had let him go, because it was strange that a small guild had been destroyed after entering an unconfirmed dungeon. In addition, he was the only survivor of the 4 who had died. The man said he could have escaped. He had also taken care of the bodies and informed the association. Also, the portal had disappeared, so they could not investigate further. However, the woman asked what he thought, since everything seemed strange to him. The man asked him if he really believed that a range had killed the hunters, and told him to wake up. After all, this was not a police case. He stated that although something had happened, everything that happened inside a dungeon could not be verified, so all they could do was collect evidence. The woman admitted that she knew that. Then the man said that they could have been one of those people. After all, several hunters had disappeared after entering unreported portals, trying to earn money and live in secret. In addition, it was impossible for small guilds to win an offer for a portal. However, the man told him to call him if there was any additional investigation, and he declared that he was leaving. While leaving, the man looked at the file, saying that his name was Sanjuno. He admitted that he had not told him the whole truth, because this case felt different from the others. This situation gave him a strange feeling. First of all, he had remained calm all the time. In addition, he had no experience in dungeons and had witnessed a tragedy. However, he was not panicking, and there were still pieces of the puzzle missing. Obviously, it could be his personality. However, he had seen people like that before. Although he knew that something was wrong, he did not know what it was. However, it was not something that he should worry about at that time, and stated that he would analyze it later. At another time, we see our protagonist walking down the streets while he reflects on what had happened. He stated that something felt strange. That dungeon did not exist in the memories of his past life. In addition, everyone had clearly seen the purchase license for the portal. It had the seal of the association, but as it was registered as an unconfirmed portal by the association, someone must have passed by them and deceived that Dawn Guild, or perhaps the same association, could be involved. However, what worried him the most was that this would not happen only to the Dawn Guild. After all, the cases of missing people had already become a problem. Although he did not know the whole story, all the guilds mentioned in the news had a common theme. They all included players like Moontown and even prodigies that would become heroes in the future. Then he stated that there could be someone trying to erase the existence of those heroes. In other words, what he needed to do now was hide his skills. In addition, he was the only survivor of a case of missing people, and if he did something suspicious, he would catch him in the act. He was 2 years old until the first selection of players to prepare, so he needed to mobilize each of his skills and develop them for then. However, he needed to find a way to grow without drawing too much attention. When looking out the window of the system, he noticed that there was a usable ability, pointing with his finger. He stated that he had that. A year later, in some place in the forest in the middle of the mountains, you could hear sounds of blows and visible sparks. The hunter hit with his sword, but the monster raised a time shield, blocking the attack, which caused the man's blade to crack. Then it broke completely, making him very nervous. After that, the monster attacked, throwing him back, but he managed to land successfully and inserted the broken sword on the ground to stop. Then he looked at the monster, but without giving him time, the monster threw himself at him. Despite this, he managed to dodge it and landed near his companions, letting out a deep sigh while the enemy turned towards them and threw them a fierce look. This was Mr. Ghoul of a high-ranked ghoul level of danger with skills superior to those of a common ghoul. The hunter got up and extended his trembling hand forward, questioning what he was doing there, in a E-rank dungeon. In addition, even the rank hunters had told him that this monster was difficult to handle. At that moment, the ghoul threw himself forward to attack, but the man with the shield reacted in time, advancing and blocking the attack with his shield. His hands trembled at the powerful impact and shouted that they could not resist much longer. However, no matter what happened, they had to cause at least some damage soon. The swordsman was horrified and explained that he was the blind man of low-rank hunters, but the ghoul did not win that title just for his physical skills. Since the monsters of this level were vulnerable to magic, any hunting team depended on it, but this monster defied that logic. The hunters who depended on low-level magic felt fear for the first time. Despite that, the price of their necessity and pride would generally be the annihilation of their group. They only had a physical damage distributor, but it was bad in close combat and their weapon was broken. In addition, there were no more weapons, although the tank had told him to attack. Surprised, he admitted that he had gathered the maximum number of people due to his pride. However, hiring people and a magician ended up harming him in this way. However, the man noticed something. He saw a young man cutting magic stones with a pickaxe. The assistants do not participate in battle. They only collect resources such as magic stones and are seen as a work of art without recognition or respect among the awakened. The hunter suddenly remembered that they had an assistant and thought they were about to die while he was only extracting crystals. Suddenly what he saw surprised him. The pickaxe and the hands of the assistant simply disappeared in the air. He wondered if it was a creation skill, since it would be useful even without high quality, considering that they could still use it. He called the assistant out loud and the assistant turned around. It was Juno. The man came up excited and asked him if he was a creator and if he knew how to make swords. He confirmed that information. The man, showing his broken sword, asked him to make a sword, preferably a strong one. Juno apologized and reminded him that he was an assistant, not a support. The swordsman trembled and said that it was not the time for that, wondering if he did not realize that they were about to die, because if they could not with the boss, he would also die. With that, Juno let out a deep sigh, accepting the request with remorse. He began to create while saying that he had a condition. After cleaning the dungeon, they would have to forget their skill, and when dividing the loot, they would receive the same part as a support. He agreed to help if they accepted these terms. The man looked at the new weapon in his hands with surprise. He despised the mediocre quality of someone who had failed as a creator and was now an assistant, finding it ridiculous to think that they could clean a dungeon just with a weapon. Juno smiled and said it was funny. The weapons in the hands of others began to change, and he stated that a good weapon was a necessary element to clean a dungeon. At that moment, our protagonist stated that he would guarantee something. While they had this element, they could clean that dungeon. Sometime later, in the Overkill Guild, one of the 3 largest guilds in Korea, a girl named Minu was walking down the corridor and stopped in front of the huge doors. Then he hit and Junin, sitting on the desk inside the room, allowed him to enter. She greeted him as the guild master and informed him that the association had sent a cooperation request. He asked him about the errors in the dungeon levels and she confirmed it, explaining that it seemed like a standard cooperation request, but with payment as indicated. Tahan asked if they had an option, because it was difficult to find another awakened individual capable of entering a closed portal by force. However, he noticed a familiar face. The system showed news about a Ranka-type dungeon that had been successfully cleaned, and recognized a familiar face in the team photo. A Ranka-type dungeon had appeared in Naruto a few weeks ago. They had sent him to the area and he was in the place, and he had definitely seen him there. The data showed that he was an assistant, and although the new dungeons appeared frequently, the possibility that a bug would occur in it was still low. And the number of cases in which there were survivors in bugs dungeons could be counted with one hand. However, this assistant had been part of a team that had had survivors, not only once, but twice. He exclaimed that this could not be a coincidence. Jesus commented that it seemed that more bugs dungeons were appearing lately. A rank D dungeon had become rank B a few days ago, and the entire team had been instantly annihilated. The leader said that the Hunter Association must be facing many problems. He added that many people were criticizing the association. After all, it was his responsibility to analyze, predict, and announce the levels of dungeons. Tahan closed his eyes and rubbed his confused chin, thinking that the guy from the association must be fighting a lot right now. He commented on the growing number of people with the ability to invade and the need to pay additional commissions for a time to monitor the situation. However, Tahan later asked about what he had asked him to investigate. She replied that he had searched everywhere, but he did not find a single Ranka or higher blacksmith. However, he had received a rank B weapon from a Japanese blacksmith, and asked if he wanted to try it, to which he replied that any lower rank weapon would be destroyed. He got up from his chair and began to say that many blacksmiths were supports. He told him to keep looking, otherwise he would continue to destroy all the weapons. At that moment, someone knocked on the door. Someone entered the office saying that something had happened. Tahan got up from his desk and walked towards him, asking what had happened. The person reported that it was an urgent message from the association, reviewing the location of a rank D dungeon from which the rookies had entered as a freed attack team. Tahan asked what the current level was and he replied that it was now a rank C. After hearing this, Tahan sighed and said that they could not afford to lose the rookies. It also seemed like an emergency, so he would go personally. They soon reached the location of the doors where the journalists had gathered. Upon noticing the presence of the guild master Overkill, they asked Tahan to comment on the errors in the dungeons and questioned him if he had come because members of his guild were part of the attack team. He ignored them, and the worried girl who had been waiting thanked him for coming personally and asked him about the situation. She explained that the attack team consisted of 6 hunters, 2 supports, and 1 assistant. However, the numbers did not matter. Since the dungeon was now rank, she wondered how long they had been inside. She replied that it had been about 2 hours. After approaching the portal, he said that he did not know how many of them were still alive, but he would do everything possible. The woman made a slight bow and thanked him. Then he looked at the door and threw his briefcase to the ground. He extended his hand towards the secretary to give her something. She put her hand in her bag, from which a bright light emerged, and pulled out a sword. Since it was a B-rank support specialized in opening subspaces, even in closed areas. After that, he handed the weapon to the guild master. At that moment, he hit the door hard. His invasion ability was activated along with a small crack that appeared on the door, growing larger in seconds. His ability to open a path to the force was capable of breaking any barrier, including doors. However, when moving to another dimension, the ability only affected the user. After this blow, his sword broke and he returned it to Jesus, who asked him to be careful. He accepted and then decided to go through the crack in the door. Inside the dungeon, he stopped immediately and looked around, noticing a change in temperature and humidity increased in the air. Due to the unpleasant smell, there must have been reptiles living there. The fact that the ground was clean indicated that it was a relatively intelligent monster, considering the level of the dungeon. The answer was quite obvious. The lizard men were humanoid reptilian monsters in the range that they lived in tribal groups, possessing a life expectancy proportional to their intelligence and combat strength. So he continued to another room thinking that he could deduce the size of the group, the combat strength, and evaluate the level of danger, as identified in the report. However, they could already be dead by the time he arrived. As he advanced, he suddenly heard battle noises and voices, and he could not help but imagine the worst. But when he got to the place where the team was, he saw something unexpected. The monsters attacked, but the hunters blocked their blows and counterattacked immediately, acting in perfect coordination as a team. A girl shot an arrow that pierced one of the monsters, and Tahan was surprised, wondering if they were really winning. By the movements of the hunters, the lizard men were visibly stronger. Suddenly his thoughts were interrupted when he saw, at the next moment, one of the monsters taking the gun from a hunter. The man looked up terrified, realizing that he was about to receive a powerful blow. Tahan ran to help him, thinking that it was not too late yet, but then, suddenly the lizard man launched his attack. However, his blow was blocked by a sword that appeared out of nowhere, leaving him deeply surprised. The hunter's breathing accelerated out of fear, while the guild master, who was running to assist him, stopped and thought it could be magic. However, he quickly discarded that idea when he realized that it was a weapon created in Adir. Still, he wanted to know who had made it. He turned around and saw the assistant near the crystals, the one who had conjured that sword. Noticing Tahan's gaze, Juno slightly turned his head and their gazes met. He looked at the team members fighting against the monsters and began to tell them. When he counted a total of 9 people, he turned his gaze towards Tahan and pointed with a finger, saying that he was the 10th. Tahan explained that this was strange since he clearly remembered that only 9 had entered. The guild master frowned and asked what he was doing. At that moment, one of the team members blocked an attack, but the monster was stronger and sent him flying backwards. The magician immediately ran to help him, while the lizard men raised their sword over their heads, preparing to hit. Seeing this, Tahan was worried and quickly moved to attack, unraveling his sword. Meanwhile, Juno looked at his open briefcase and thought that he did not expect Jun Tahan to come personally to help them. He noticed that Tahan had brought an extra weapon. The warm wind caused by Tahan's blow rubbed his face. He covered his sword with flames and pressed harder against the opponent's sword, breaking his defense. Then he ordered the hunters behind him to retreat. The magician helped his partner to get up and thanked him for the assistance. After that, Tahan disarmed his opponent, rekindled the flames and charged forward, dealing powerful blows. And the monster's body was soon covered in numerous cuts from which green blood was sprouting until his corpse fell to the ground with a loud bang. Tahan explained that despite being a B-rank weapon, he had not yet reached his maximum potential. He looked up and saw the lizard man charging at him. The monster attacked and Tahan defended himself before jumping back. He stopped next to Juno, who called his name. He asked him if this happened every time he used a skill, as it seemed very exhausting. The others ran towards the monster, and the guild leader asked him if he was asking for trouble. Suddenly blue sparks appeared on his face and a weapon was materialized from it. Juno handed it over, asking him to take it and not destroy his poor weapon. Tahan looked at the sword surprised because Juno had materialized it with a single gesture. Tahan commented that he was an extremely skilled weapon maker. He noticed the spike in his hand and questioned if he was an assistant, remembering that low-ranking supports sometimes entered the dungeons in that role. But suddenly the protagonist interrupted his thoughts. He took the broken sword from Tahan's hands and said that there was a condition: after cleaning and leaving the dungeon, he would have to forget him and his skills. Tahan extended his hand towards the new sword and asked if he really thought he could simply forget him because he wanted to do it. In response to his words, Juno began to destroy the sword and said that if not, he should let it go and finish everyone with his high-class weapon. The guildmaster sighed and thought that the weapon would break as soon as he used a skill with it, so having a few more would not be too much. He took the sword and replied that he understood everything, and also promised to forget about it. At that moment, Juno smiled and stated that he could leave. After that, the guildmaster hurried to attack and approached the angry lizard man. Then he lit the sword with a bright flame and hit it, causing a great explosion of flames around him. The monster used more strength to try to resist his attack, but in the end his sword broke. However, Tahan thought that he just wanted to counter the attack, but his opponent's weapon ended up breaking first. He looked at his sword and thought that his control was visibly better than usual and wondered if the weapon itself was strong. Then he looked at Juno, who was collecting crystals at that time, and expressed his surprise that he was able to manifest a weapon above rank B. At that moment, the monster decided to attack him with a broken weapon, raising his sword over his head to hit. Tahan prepared himself thinking that this was interesting, wanting to see what the weapon was capable of. He declared that he would increase power with those thoughts, and nailed the tip to the monster's abdomen, which caused the flames of the sword to pass through the monster's body, and emerge in a bright flash. Without wasting time, the guild master rushed from the monster's shoulder and jumped behind him, then rose up and raised his sword again, lighting it once more. He nailed the blade to the monster's head, piercing it, making it scream loudly. Then the blood came out of his mouth and his body collapsed on the ground. At that moment, Tahan noticed that there was not a single scratch on his sword, which at least he needed, but it was interrupted by someone who called him. It was people thanking him for his presence, since they only survived thanks to him. He approached them and said that it seemed that nobody was seriously injured, which made him happy. One of the men focused his attention on Juno and said that with his weapon they would not have been able to even fight, but they endured thanks to him. The guild leader himself directed his gaze at him, thinking about something. Then he approached and asked his name. The protagonist questioned the reason for the question. He replied that they should meet to be able to call each other correctly, and he introduced himself as Jun Tahan while he closed his backpack. Juno turned at him, then got up and approached, saying his name. Looking at the man behind him, he said he would lead the stone man at the entrance. The man accepted with a confused expression. Just when Juno was about to leave, Tahan stopped him and asked him to wait, offering to accompany him to the boss room. He took the backpack in his hands, and Juno declared that he was only an assistant. The guild leader handed the backpack to another man, explaining that a mistake in the dungeon prevented them from leaving without defeating the boss, so he explained that he could take care of it. At that moment, Tahan said that no weapon would be capable of fully supporting his ability. However, breaking the weapons that he had created would be unnecessary. The protagonist replied with a touch of irritation that his weapon would not break, to which Tahan replied that he thought the same, and explained that they were in a dungeon with errors. The creatures that lived there were not simple lizard men, and if the boss was the same, then it would not hurt to have a little extra precaution. Juno sighed heavily, deciding to accept. He threw the backpacks to the ground, and as soon as he approached him, he asked him if everything he had to do was to move on. They soon found themselves in a large hall illuminated by torches. Frozen at the entrance, they saw a throne at the end of the hall where Mr. Danger Level Lizard was sitting. Tahan explained that they should ignore the existing danger levels and any information about them, and with a smile he said that they would end this as quickly as possible. Both activated their skills and Tahan complained that the weapon could break, to which the protagonist replied that he had already assured that this would not happen. Then, the Lizard King extended his hand towards them, pointing the tip of his spear at them, ordering his lizard men to charge and attack. As soon as the lizard men attacked, they both jumped back. Then Tahan rushed from the wall and advanced quickly. Mr. Lizard noticed this, and when he landed too close, the beast swung his claw. At that moment, he held his sword in front of him. Just then, the monster swept his tail forward, sending a powerful gust of wind in his direction, forcing him to increase the distance between them. Then he rushed again and ran, but this time Mr. Lizard charged directly at him. Their swords collided with a strong rumble and both withdrew again. However, the Lord mounted his lizard man, who began to spit fire tons from his mouth. Then a powerful jet of fire shot at the man. He wanted to block the attack with his sword, but Juno created a shield in front of him just in time, protecting him from the intense explosion. He himself stood aside watching the fight. At that moment, the lizard man charged, throwing Tahan backwards. Landing next to Juno, he asked him if he was not just a creator of weapons. The protagonist replied that a shield could also become a weapon. He lit his sword with flames and smiled, saying that after those words, he ran towards his opponent and Mr. Lizard swung his hand, throwing a chain from his spear, which had a sharp tip. The chain hit the sword and twisted around the blade. Then Mr. Lizard withdrew his hand, dragging the enemy towards him. Tahan was dragged directly towards the open mouth of the lizard man. Seeing this, Juno extended his hand forward and told him to stop doing nonsense in the fight. He deconstructed the weapon and Tahan, releasing it, smiled and asked him if he had not asked him to try it. A new weapon appeared in his hand, and the exhausted protagonist told him to take care of his pet. After that, the chain weapon, which had not yet faded, flew over the head of the lizard man and Tahan delivered several cuts to his mouth. Seeing how blood came out, the monster jumped over. Then the man threw a sword at him, but the monster managed to dodge it in time. In a blink of an eye, Tahan approached a lot and then kicked him with all his strength, sending him flying to one side. Mr. Lizard fell from the back of his lizard man, and at that moment, Tahan raised him into the air, swinging his sword and setting it on fire again. What the monster saw made him nervous. He did not have time to react before receiving a powerful blow that cut his arm. Realizing that he could not defend himself, he turned his gaze towards Juno, who had not participated in the battle. Grabbing his spear, he charged directly at him. The protagonist was prepared for this, and just before the attack arrived, he raised a shield in front of him, which made the monster anxious. The protagonist then asked with disgust who had thought it was a good idea to point a weapon at him. At that moment, Tahan appeared behind the monster, wrapped in flaming flames. Mr. Lizard did not know what to do, he was trapped on both sides. Meanwhile, the people outside continued to observe the door, seeing how it changed color to blue, which made them happy, since it meant that the door was opening. After that, El Grino's team emerged from the portal. The journalists immediately rushed to Tahan, anxious to know what was inside the dungeon and what had happened to the boss. The guards surrounded him and Jesus asked him if he was injured, to which he replied that he was fine. His comrades from the guild thanked him from behind for his help, with the girl saying that if it were not for him, they would already be dead. Meanwhile, Juno delivered the resources collected to the man and said that since he had already received his payment in advance, he needed to leave. The protagonist, taking one last look at the team, simply left. One of the journalists, meanwhile, approached the leader of the guild and asked him how he had managed to clean the dungeon so quickly. He turned around and said that he was not alone there, but when he did not see Juno behind him, he froze. The man asked him if he had done that while everyone was, in some way, blocking together with teamwork, which allowed them to handle everyone. The warrior next to him said that his weapons had broken and that if it were not for the leader of the guild, they would have been destroyed a long time ago. Upon hearing this, Tahan explained that thanks to those people who continued to make weapons for them, they had lasted so long. The man replied that he was talking about the support who was there as an assistant, who was also a weapon maker. Still confused, the warrior claimed that he knew that someone had helped us support and then asked the girl if he had that ability. She said she was not sure. After hearing his answers, Tahan turned to the rest of the team and asked them if they had seen him create weapons. They looked at the backpack they had left behind, where the pick should have been, and someone commented that he did not even have it. Another member of the team replied that he did have it, but he must have lost it. However, he had collected all the mana stones. Tahan was confused and wondered what had happened. After all, he had created weapons for all of them, but it seemed that they had forgotten. He remembered how Juno had asked him to forget everything about the creation of weapons, and was surprised to ask if that was a payment for rent. However, he wondered how someone could use an exclusive ability of Ranka or H creators. His friends called him without understanding that he was wrong. After that, he threw the case of the weapon into the hands of his vice leader and ran in search of Juno. He and his secretary watched him confused. He continued running and looking around, wondering where Juno had gone, questioning if he had really disappeared. Suddenly he stopped. Juno was close, hidden behind a brick wall. Seeing that there was no one else around, Tahan realized that he could not reach him at that moment. His members of the guild ran to him asking him what had happened. He turned to Wu and told him that he needed to find someone now. Then a scene of our protagonist coming out was shown. Time passed, and soon Wu arrived at the guild leader with the news that he had arranged dungeon near S, at 1 in the afternoon, with a group of 5 people. Tahan told him that he had done a great job, however Jesus asked why he was interested in the protagonist. Tahan looked at the tablet and asked him if he really thought that way. He considered that of course, Juno was a creator of rank D, otherwise it would be difficult to imagine. He reviewed his general information and thought that according to all the records, he was classified as D, but he had a rent payment, and that ability refuted everything. The rent payment was a low-ranking ability. The rent payment ability was incredibly powerful, and stated that he had never seen anyone use it that way. In addition, Juno was using it only to hide his true ability. A weapon creator like him could easily level up, but he would discover it when he met him. At that moment he felt something that he had never felt before. He remembered the feeling of holding the sword that Juno had created and thought he could fight with all his strength without worrying that the weapon would break. Despite having met many blacksmiths considered the best, as soon as they presented their latest products, he took them with hope and tried to use his skill in them. Although those blacksmiths were confident in their products, as soon as he made a powerful blow of fire, he immediately felt disappointed, since all the weapons broke. In the end, the blacksmiths who had been so confident in their products ended up holding their heads frustrated to see their items destroyed. None of the weapons met Tahan's expectations. Not to mention that the creation ability was limited to normal types of weapons, but Juno had created something that greatly exceeded that limitation of type and ability. It was as if there were no restrictions with Juno's ability. This was possible, something that he had not used because he did not have the right weapon. The time required to clean a ranged dungeon with 5 people was 4 hours, leaving only 1 remaining hour. He got up and asked Jesus, who was still on schedule. She explained that she had a meeting with the master of the Chemo Guild, however he told her to cancel the meeting because he would leave early. He wanted to make sure not to miss the opportunity. Meanwhile, inside the dungeon, the team was fighting against orcs. A warrior pierced them in the stomach, causing them death, and observed how their bodies fell. Soon he was surprised by the ability of that creation and wondered if it was really something made by an assistant. If that amount of mana could destroy a boss weapon, it must be at least a C rank ability, or maybe even higher. When the weapon broke, he thought that everything was already lost, but he never imagined that his assistant had such a skill. He picked up the sword and laughed out loud, saying that it was simply impressive. I had never seen a sword of such high quality. He looked at Juno and thanked him for his help. Then he asked the girl if he was not in any guild, maybe they should recruit him in his. She replied that it would be a great idea and said that it seemed a bit embarrassing that he was just an assistant. He asked if that was true, to which he laughed and replied saying that she had a good eye. Hearing the conversation, the protagonist realized that he could use more mana than he had imagined and thought about how much the team had fought, even if it was not a failed dungeon. He walks to the place where the mana stones grew and threw his backpack to the ground, thinking that if he had had more mana at that time, everything would have been different in that dungeon. He felt an incredible amount of mana like never before. After defeating the golem and using all his mana, he never appeared again. What he felt now was nothing more than the mana of an awakened range, but he felt relieved knowing that there was no problem in creating weapons. He created a peak and looked at it, thinking about who would have thought that memories could be so useful. The basic ability of a creator is the creation of special objects whose quality depends on the amount of mana used. Despite being a very intuitive ability, there is a way to increase the efficiency of the ability, but it is still unknown. This is the level of understanding. The higher the level of understanding of the created object, the better its quality will be. The strong point of the ability is that by increasing the quality, it creates the same object, but with variable quality depending on the level of understanding. He remembered how much he had trained when he learned about this hidden ability, studying the material, training in support and going to the workshop for weapon creation lessons, but he achieved more than he expected. So he began to mine mana stones with his peak and thought that he did not know how much better it would be, but compared to the use of mana, it seemed more than just a slight increase. However, it was still not enough. It was difficult to use creation and payment at the same time. The equipment that affected mana was expensive, so there was no way to buy it now. At least I could buy a mana potion, the only mass-produced item that affected mana. He needed to request some of those potions, but with an assistant salary, it would still be difficult. However, no one would hire a rank D support, so he had no other option. He opened the window showing the passive mana absorption ability and thought that the result was not bad. It was reassuring. He was very close to reaching the goal of 20% mana absorption. Cleaning several dungeons would not be enough. A protected dungeon only yielded a little more than 1%, a very low efficiency. There was only one option left: go to the insect dungeon. That was the only way to absorb a large amount of mana at once. Compared to other dungeons, it absorbed several times more mana. He explained that before entering, he could not predict the difficulty of the rank error in a dungeon. It would also be difficult for him if Tahan was not there. He considered finding a dungeon with a C- rank boss to prepare, since advancing as an awakening rank depended on understanding the value of mana absorption. Soon, the team managed to clean the dungeon successfully and left. They all thanked each other for their cooperation and said goodbye. The protagonist, realizing that they had not said a word about his ability, was complacent that he had erased his memories. Suddenly a familiar voice calling his name made him freeze. He turned around immediately and saw the guild leader Ori Uberkill approaching along with the secretary. Tahan asked him if he remembered. Upon hearing that, the protagonist realized that the ability had not worked on him, so he sighed deeply and asked if he would believe him if he said he did not remember. Tahan gave him a presentation card and replied that he would not believe it. He took the card and asked why he had come, to which Tahan replied that he needed to talk to him about something and that he needed a minute of his time. Seeing the information on the card, the protagonist thought that Uberkill was one of the best guilds in Korea. He could not join a guild so big yet, but he still needed to find an excuse to leave. After putting the card in his pocket, he turned around and said that he did not have time, that he was in a hurry for an important meeting, but Tahan did not intend to let him go so easily. He put a hand on his shoulder, saying that he would not regret this conversation, that it would not take long, and that he would also pay for dinner. Juno commented that being a guild leader should free a lot of time if he was using it to talk with a range of support. The protagonist looked at him closely and thought that he did not like that very much, but he needed to check how the rent payment worked with him. As he walked to his side, he agreed to speak, but only if it was fast. Tahan smiled and agreed. After that, they arrived at a restaurant and took a table in a private room. When the table was set with several dishes, the protagonist asked why a guild leader would speak with a range of support. He doubted it was just because Tahan had free time to talk to him. Tahan said that according to what he had seen, Juno was a berserker due to his incredible strength. He needed a weapon that could resist such force, so the most important part of a berserker's job was to find a supplier of suitable weapons. Obviously, he had gone to many places looking, traveling through the country and beyond, starting with a blacksmith considered the best in his field and ending with the few remaining weapon makers. If there was even the slightest opportunity, he was in charge of a weapon. Time and money did not matter. However, all the weapons he had used so far had not managed to fully resist his abilities. But there was only one exception, the sword that our protagonist had created. The agonist understood one thing: the agreement did not have an effect on him. He had not thought that the berserker had an ability to cancel. He had been too careless. He needed to be more careful when using that ability with high-ranking hunters. Tahan called his name, and with a serious expression, he said that he was going to ask directly. Then he asked him if the protagonist would like to join his guild, surprising Jesus. He stated that he already knew that Juno was not a member of any guild. If he joined, Tahan promised that he would receive the best treatment. They would pay 10,000 million yuan for his entry, they would cover the operating costs separately, and provide dividends with a one-year contract and an increase of 10% for each renovation. Juno did not let him finish, got up from the table and apologized. He said he had no plans to join a guild for now, so he would have to reject the offer. If that was all, he would leave. He thanked Tahan for the food with a slight smile and left the room. Tahan called him, trying to stop him. Jesus asked why he had made such an offer, since he could not have done it without a reason. He was about to say something about the conditions, but he interrupted him, saying that if she had experienced the same as him, he would not be saying that. It had been a long time since he felt the scream of a sword, and with a weapon like that, he felt that he could do anything. And this one resisted. She wanted to tell him something, but while he was drinking a drink, she said that of course, it was not just for that feeling. Then he asked how many high-level weapons had been broken in a single year. His words reminded him of the astronomical amounts he spent on weapons, even if they broke because they could not withstand the tension. If the weapon was not of a certain rank, it would not allow the guild leader to use his skills. After thinking about it, she agreed with him and said that if it were possible, a price like that for a contract would really be insignificant. But for now, the problem was that no one was able to do something like that, not even among those considered the best. However, he did not let her finish and said that Juno could definitely do it. She was surprised by those words, and he continued to say that, therefore, no matter what Juno asked, he wanted to recruit him at all costs. Time passed and the protagonist was walking down the street. However, he still could not believe having rejected such an offer. The Overkill and Jun Tahan Guild. This would not have helped much, but it was still too soon. However, he just needed to be patient. He would definitely find him again. Meanwhile, in an unknown dungeon, several goblin corpses were scattered on the ground, and a hunter observed how his partner had a torn limb. When he regained his breath, he nervously looked at the one who had done it and asked him who he was. The man nailed his sword into the hunter's body and said he was quite entertaining. At times like these, people complained and begged to be saved, but the one who would become the hero was different. He looked at the only survivor with a smile. The boy asked why he suddenly wanted to kill them and take the trophy. However, the man replied that he was not so bored and that he did not want to tell him. He took the sword out of the corpse and said that telling someone who was about to die would be useless, but he would reveal it if they defeated him. He threw the sword over his shoulder with a smile and told him to come quickly if he did not want to die. The hunter squeezed his teeth and thought he was definitely a difficult opponent, because he would die if he stayed at a distance. He decided to close the gap and charged forward with a loud scream, thinking he had to go for it, even if he lost an arm or a leg. In response, the man raised his sword in front of him, blocking the blow. The hunter screamed, putting all his strength into the attack. Then he began to deliver new attacks, but they were all repelled. While he watched the sparks coming out of his swords when he collided, the man suddenly disarmed him, sending the sword flying over his head. The hunter looked at the sword in shock, and then his opponent kicked him with all his strength, sending him through the hall. The hunter crashed against the wall and trembled in pain. He said he was sad, dragging his sword down the floor. The man said that he had voluntarily offered himself for this because it was the first classified domination of a hero. However, he did not know that he would be such a small fish. Even so, the courage he had shown when doing this was worthy of praise. When his shadow crept over him, the hunter begged for forgiveness with tears in his eyes and began to pray for mercy. However, the man did not care and raised his sword over him, smiling while he said he would take care of him. Then he delivered a fatal blow from which a torrent of blood flowed. He looked at him with disappointment and cursed, saying that he thought that for the first time in a long time, he was going to have a real fight, but this was not even a warm-up for him. He questioned the look of injustice on the hunter's face. However, he told him not to worry, as he would make sure to say that he fought bravely against the boss and died like a hero. Taking out his phone, he took a photo of the corpse and said with a smile that this was something common in a dungeon with an error of rank H. After finishing, he looked at the photos and said that they were not bad. The collection had grown. Moving through the images of the other corpses, he added that all his life he had been dedicated to collecting them. Suddenly, for some reason, he felt a chill go through his spine. He told the priestess with disgust that he hated to feel that evil energy and ordered him to either hide it or stop hiding it. The doors of the corridor opened and the priestess entered, greeting him with a smile and apologizing. He said he was in a hurry because he had heard that there were valuable components there. He pulled out the sword from the corpse and replied that there were only fools there. She passed by before he could finish talking, and threateningly, he asked him if those words meant that he wanted to go against the executioner. He sighed with irritation, calling her sensitive and telling her to clean the place. She used her skills, accepting and declaring that she was an expert at it. With a somber expression, he reminded her of his promise that he would send him after a S-rank hunter. Due to that conscience or whatever, he needed to kill them, but he could not use all his power, so if he followed him just for that, the priestess approached the hunter's corpse and creating a magic circle around him. He assured her that she did not need to worry since she would contact him soon. A glow appeared on the corpse's wound and he asked who it would be this time. A claw emerged from the dead hunter's body while the monster arose, and the priestess, with a smile of admiration, called him a boy and happily exclaimed that he was right. A tall humanoid monster, whose body burned with energy, appeared before her. Time passed and a new day began. The guards of the association and the curious ones gathered around the open doors. Juno, who had just arrived, noticed someone familiar and looked at him with his hat and asked him if he was really there. Silence hung between them. After a brief pause, the protagonist asked what he was doing there. Tahan responded that he had good eyesight to recognize him so quickly, and looking at the case on his back, he commented that he only knew a person who carried a weapon like that. So what was he doing there? Tahan replied that the member of the guild who was supposed to come had suddenly gotten sick, so they had sent him in his place. The protagonist did not believe him and was about to question him when one of the team members shouted that it was time to leave. Tahan passed by him and suggested that they enter the dungeon. The protagonist said he knew he would find him again, but he did not expect it to be so soon. He decided to accept the situation and adjust his plans, so they passed through the doors and found themselves in a spacious cave. Tahan asked why Juno did not join a guild. He replied that he had already rejected it and did not want to talk about it anymore. One of the men asked if they had heard about the door auction that took place in Shunin that morning. The man said he had heard that the Egam guild had won. He added that a friend was there and said that they made such a high offer that no one dared to compete. Juno was interested, wondering if they had really found something there. Tahan asked him if he was interested in buying a door, since if he joined the guild, he could easily acquire special doors above rank B. This was not only due to resources, but also because the name of the guild granted certain privileges. Joining a guild meant a lot to an awakened individual. People admired and respected the great guilds. A hunter not only earned employment, but also obtained better income and rewards compared to others. In addition, by becoming part of a guild, a hunter enjoyed various benefits derived from his influence. For example, they could access special doors that required not only skills, but also strong political connections. With this structure, the rare treasures obtained in such places were naturally monopolized by the great guilds. Tahan stated that Juno probably had a goal as an awakened. Whatever it was, it would be easier to achieve with overkill. He did not understand why Juno was still rejecting. The protagonist answered sharply that it was none of his business. He understood why Tahan acted that way. Probably no one had rejected an offer to join Overkill before, so to make it clear, he will not join any guild under any circumstance. These words surprised Tahan, who stood still for a moment. He thought it would be because of the injury he had received after the destruction of the Dawn Guild, as he had read in the report, or it would be for something else. Whatever it was, he could not give up. Time passed as they advanced through the cave. The magician in front began to illuminate the path. They looked around when, suddenly a man ran into something and exclaimed, "What is this?" He touched his hair, feeling a texture similar to a thread between his fingers and asked, "Is this a cobweb?" The girl raised her staff, casting more light in the area. The leader of the group advanced and said that this was where the monster's territory began. It seemed that all the hunters there were newbies, so he briefly explained, although everyone had already read the report. The spider legionaries began to appear. Although each creature had a low level of difficulty, their peculiarity was that they lived in groups. According to the recognition analysis, there were about 50 of them, which was not too many. The hunters were warned about the paralyzing poison present in the fangs of the creatures, and they were warned not to let them bite them. Tahan crouched, pulled the sword out of his case, and turned to Juno, saying that the creatures were about to appear, suggesting that he stay close. The protagonist, with a sarcastic smile, replied that he did not need to worry about an assistant who would only prepare for the fight. However, Tahan stated that all combat units had the responsibility of protecting the supports and assistants, regardless of skill or situation. That was a rule that all hunters had to follow. Juno, with a dissatisfied expression, replied that no one else followed principles like that, but her words were interrupted by a scream from a member of the team, announcing the arrival of the creatures. The noises grew louder and everyone immediately prepared, raising their eyes to the ceiling. The sharp sounds of the claws of the spiders resonated as they approached, moving through the walls and the ceiling. Seeing the monsters, the swordsmen trembled with fear, trying to calm down and remembering that they would win if they followed what they had learned. Thus, the spider legionaries appeared individually, classified as E-ranked threats, but in groups they became D-ranked, increasing in danger as their numbers grew. A horde of creatures advanced quickly and the hunters prepared for battle. The swordsman assumed a stable posture and with a precise blow he knocked down a spider, squeezing its teeth and attacking again. Meanwhile, another hunter blocked the monsters with his shield, concentrating energy and repelling them with a powerful blow. The magician used his magic, creating sparks from his staff that pierced the enemies. Observing the battle, Tahan concluded that despite being novices, they were performing well, which gave him less concern. Juno, who was watching from one side of the hall, sighed in surprise, drawing Tahan's attention. He turned around and Juno commented that it seemed that there were many more than a few dozen spiders. At that moment, several of them jumped from the ceiling, attacking the group. Tahan activated his ability, balancing his sword and burning multiple creatures. His flabby bodies fell to the ground. He continued his attack, reflecting that the durability of these spiders was lower than other monsters. Only by releasing a little energy from his sword could he eliminate it without even using the blade, which allowed him to finish the raid without damaging his weapon. Meanwhile, shouts of help came from another direction. 3 members of the team were surrounded by a large group of spiders, making the fight increasingly difficult. The team leader exclaimed that the number of enemies was much greater than expected. There were not only 50 spiders, but hundreds. The situation worsened and the magician announced that he was running out of mana. Decided to help, Tahan ran towards them, calling Juno to follow him. However, the protagonist went in the opposite direction, saying that it was better to help the others while he finished there and then joined the group. Tahan stopped, confused, when he saw him walking towards the monsters. When a spider came out to attack him, he ran forward, worried, screaming to crouch, thinking that by not using energy on his sword, he could be hurt. But at that moment, Juno stopped, closed his eyes, and when he opened them, his irises changed color. He observed a cobweb forming on the ceiling. The spider that had entered the cobweb was immediately pierced by a sharp blade, and Tahan was stunned by the scene. The body of the spider fell to Juno's feet, who calmly analyzed the situation. Among all the weapons he could create at that time, the sword would be of the highest quality. It would be more efficient to create several swords and use them simultaneously, but with his current mana reserves, that was impossible. With a slight movement of his finger, he pulled the sword out of the body of the spider, pointed it forward, and thought that there was nothing better he could do at that moment. At his order, the sword rose in the air and began to spin around him, waiting for his next order. Observing the nearby monsters, he turned around and pointed with his finger, sending the sword towards them. As he approached the monsters, the sword crossed a spider in its path, and then passed to the next, cutting it quickly. With just a movement of his hand, Juno controlled the sword, making it sweep the cave at a furious speed. At one point, he raised his finger towards the ceiling, pointing to the remaining spiders. After that, the sword shot forward and turned around like a whirlwind, going through everything in its path. When he finished, Tahan looked at him astonished, then looked at the many corpses lying at his feet. Then he turned his gaze towards the sword embedded in the body of the spider and wondered, confused, if that was some kind of AA attack. While observing the sword dissolve, he reflected that in less than 10 seconds of combat, Juno had finished off those dozens of spiders. He didn't even know that the supports could fight that way. When he noticed his gaze, Juno pointed to the rest of the group and asked him what he was doing, if he was not going to help him. Due to his words, Tahan suddenly remembered the other teammates whom he had initially run to help. He turned around and saw that they were barely managing to stand up. Realizing that the situation was not good, he activated his ability and said that they would speak after everything was over. Before leaving, Juno called him and pointed to the bodies behind him, asking him to take care of them. After all, they would not think that an assistant had done all that. Tahan lowered his mask, thinking about it for a second, then pushed hard from the ground and advanced, burning the bodies. Soon, the battle ended and the team members gathered to rest. One of the hunters thanked Tahan for his help, saying that they had survived thanks to him, but he was a little surprised. At first he thought he was familiar, but who would have guessed that he was the master of the guild or Uberkill? Tahan apologized for not having mentioned it before, and explained that he wanted to explore the dungeon discreetly. The mage was excited to discover his true identity and thanked him. Then with admiration, he said that it was incredible to see how he handled all those spiders. A little embarrassed, he hesitated for a moment before asking if it would be possible to take a photo with him once they left. The hunter, who had returned with Juno, interrupted her before she could finish, announcing loudly that they were already back. She made a disappointed expression, thinking she had missed a golden opportunity. The young man smiled, apologizing for the delay. They began to collect secondary resources. They walked through the area, and it seemed that there were no more monsters left. He pointed out a dark corridor and said that there was another step there. He thought they could advance. The leader sighed loudly, and said that he did not believe they were in condition to continue clearing the dungeon. It was a shame to do so, but they had to end there. The swordsman exclaimed, surprised that they were already so close. Why had he decided that? The man got up and crossed his arms on his chest, saying that the number of spiders they had found, the geography of the dungeon, and everything else were different from the intelligence report. Dungeons exist as separate portals of the world. They are areas with strange creatures and geographical characteristics that are not found on Earth. Currently, the concept of dungeons and awakened beings is not completely defined, so for novice hunters, information about dungeons is the most important thing. Few awakened individuals can adapt to a dungeon if they have never encountered one before. This means defeat, and in the worst case, death. This is how the explorers emerged, awakened individuals with detection or stealth skills who group together and begin to collect information about the dungeons. The rank of a strong dungeon increases after such recognitions, and thus they began to be called explorers. The leader also added that the precision of these recognition missions generally exceeds 98%. It is unlikely that this is just a mistake. It cannot be ruled out that this can also be a poorly classified dungeon. The swordsman was confused and wanted to argue, but then he turned his gaze towards Tahan and asked if, with the guild master with them, they could still continue. The man said he understood that they wanted to continue clearing the dungeon, but the help of the guild master alone would not be enough. If they were not careful, they could all end up in danger. Frustrated, the young man said that he really wanted to clear the dungeon because he had personal reasons. The girl also expressed her frustration, saying that she wanted to finish the dungeon. He asked what could be more important than their lives. If they entered the boss's room, there would be no turning back. He did not want to leave either, but first they needed to report the situation. The guild leader joined the conversation and said that he agreed with them. The team leader looked at him with a confused expression, and Tahan stated that although he was there to study everything, he was still a member of the group. If the leader decided to continue clearing the dungeon, he had no reason to object. However, if he wanted to study everything, he would have to enter the boss's room. He looked at Juno, who agreed in sign, and the man made a reverence, saying that he would trust him for this. Grateful, he began to talk about being the team leader, but Tahan reassured him by asking him to continue leading. The man agreed and announced that they would advance. He gave instructions to the others to follow him, and while they passed through a large corridor, they were in front of a set of doors. The leader stopped and reported that he believed that they had reached the boss's room, so he would give some final instructions. First, he said that the boss of this dungeon was a high-ranking spider queen with considerably high combat skills. He was considered a relatively easy boss, mainly focused on giving birth to legionary spiders. However, those were only the initial reports and nobody knew what kind of creature would really be behind that door. He pushed the doors, announcing that they would enter. As the doors slowly opened, illuminating the space, the group advanced. As they advanced, Tahan frowned when he realized that he could not perceive any particular presence, nothing at all. The leader raised his shield in front of him and ordered the group to prepare. It was then that they saw a massive spider hanging from the ceiling, and he shouted that he was the boss. At that moment, the swordsman asked if that was the queen spider they had talked about. Relieved, the magician commented that it was good since the boss was as expected. Then he took his staff and declared that he would attack first. He conjured a sphere of sparks and threw it forward, hitting all the monsters with an electric discharge. With a satisfied smile, he clenched his fist, but his eyes soon turned white with shock. The body of the queen spider fell to the ground, torn, with half of its abdomen missing, something that was clearly not caused by the attack of the magician. Seeing this, the leader of the group became nervous, wondering if the boss was already dead. Realizing that something was not going well, he ordered the group to retreat, but everyone felt a powerful pressure coming from the corpse and wondered what it was. Another leg of the queen fell on the torn abdomen of the spider. She emitted a loud scream, extended her arms and summoned her army. It was an Arakan, a queen of higher rank B who ruled over all kinds of spider monsters. He possessed a high intelligence, was extremely cunning and could not be reproduced. In his place, he invaded the territories of other similar monsters, expanding his army to his cost while sharing his power with his subordinates. Arakan smiled as he watched the terrified people and then swung his leg to finish them off. However, suddenly a flame emerged in his path. Tahan blocked his blow with a movement of his sword and looked at her, thinking how he would never have expected this monster to appear here. He knew that without skirmish skill, he could not even scratch her. With just one blow, his sword had already cracked, and he reflected that he needed to cause as much damage as possible with a single attack. Then he advanced, delivering a blow to the monster's abdomen, but his sword broke instantly, which made him curse in his mind. Despite that, he left a deep wound on Arakan's abdomen before withdrawing, thinking that with his broken sword he could not handle a deadly blow. By the time he landed, the Spider Queen had already raised her leg to attack, but was intercepted by a sword that suddenly appeared, blocking his blow and protecting Tahan. Juno advanced while the guild leader concentrated on buying time to create a new weapon for him. When Juno finished creating the weapon, he suddenly felt something strange and shuddered. When he looked at himself, he wondered if he had exhausted all his mana, reflecting that it was already incredible that it would have lasted so long. He took a potion bottle out of his pocket, and after drinking it, he thought about how the potion could only be used once a day since excessive use would cause addiction. He threw the bottle aside, and feeling an increase in energy, he commented with a smile that the effect had been excellent. Meanwhile, Tahan was deeply worried, and in an instant a sword appeared in front of him. The creator of the sword told him to win time. After that, he thought about how impressive the rank B boss was. If it hadn't been for the mistake, it should have been just a rank boss called the Spider Queen. Fortunately, Tahan was there, because dealing with this monster would have been difficult for them. Not only would the level of danger be that of a rank B boss, but the level itself was changing. At that moment, the new Spider Queen swung her leg, hitting her opponent, who immediately blocked her by swinging his sword. Then he began to launch quick attacks with a smile, which he countered quickly. Watching them, Juno thought that his raw combat power exceeded that of 5 lower-ranked fighters. As for Arakan's ability, it was not possible to depend only on Tahan. He told the rest of the group to get up because they needed to be ready to fight. Arakan had changed his goal. The leader of the group exclaimed nervously, "Who is he?" The others got up and asked why such a talented awakening was secretly disguised as an assistant. He turned to them, and pointing to the small spiders that were approaching, he said they had something to deal with first. He shook his hand, creating a weapon, and told them to choose. They could take the weapon they had in front of them and clean the dungeon fighting the spiders, or they could run and wait outside until everything was over. Extending his hand towards them, he said he was sure they would take the right decision. After that, the members of the group picked up their new weapons and joined the battle. The swordsman softened his sword, easily cutting the body of the spider, thinking that this was incredible. He had never wielded a weapon like that before. He softened the sword a few more times, preventing the spiders from attacking, and seeing the clean cuts on their bodies he thought it felt like cutting paper. Suddenly a loud crunch distracted the swordsman from the battle. The mage had used magic and her staff began to emit electric sparks. She was so fascinated by the sight that she smiled widely, then confidently shook her staff, letting lightning fall on the spiders. The team leader was completely surprised. He had thought he had only changed the weapon, but the power of his skills had increased several times. After the girl's blow, only charred corpses remained on the ground, and the team leader, turning his gaze towards Juno, exclaimed in his thoughts, "Who is he?" Meanwhile, while the swordsman was still intact, he took a break after a series of blows and clenched his teeth, thinking that this was to be expected from a rank B boss. It was difficult to win time. His opponent smiled widely, and then emitted a loud scream, leaning towards him, his body already covered by multiple cuts from his attacks. Lighting his sword with flames once again, he thought he needed to finish this as quickly as possible. And Erican, seeing the light emitted by his sword, froze for a moment. After that, Tahan threw himself forward to attack, but she would not fall so easily. He was faster and delivered a powerful lightning blow, causing her to collapse instantly. Then he looked at his sword and thought that the weapon was still intact. It was better than he had imagined. Suddenly he noticed several small spiders on the ground that were heading towards the girl, who, looking around alarmed, exclaimed, "Where did they come from and where are they going?" The leader of the group shouted that they were all heading towards the guild master. Tahan turned towards them and ordered them to retreat. After that, he thought to himself, did she hide the spiders? The situation was serious. Immediately the spiders completely covered the wound in Erican's body, and Tahan stated that she had sacrificed the spiders to restore her health. After that, all the wounds on Erican's head were healed, and she looked at her opponent. Then he pushed himself up with his hands, helping himself to get up, and once again he stood on the man, looking at the Spider Queen and the 1,000 little subjects behind her. He said that until everyone was dead, she would continue to regenerate repeatedly. He activated his ability, and launched into attack thinking that he needed to increase his firepower to end everything in a single blow. Suddenly his sword broke, and when he realized this, he cursed out loud. At the same time, the protagonist smiled and said that it was better than he had imagined. He extended his hand forward, creating a weapon once more, and said that although he had created a sword with the remaining mana, he did not think it would be destroyed. After that, a massive sword crashed into the ground near Tahan's feet, and the protagonist told him to take it. It was not a one-handed sword like the ones he had used before, it was the strongest weapon he could create at that time. Without saying a word, Tahan placed his hand on the pommel, and as soon as he took the sword, he felt that with this weapon he could defeat them all in a single blow. The sheet in his hand immediately caught fire, and crying screams began to spread from the tip to the length of the ground. He smiled and said that he was not very familiar with two-handed swords, but it seemed that he was fine. After that, he took the sword from the ground using all his strength to hold it, squeezed his teeth, and loaded forward. As soon as he was close enough, he softened the sword and unleashed a powerful blow of fire. Erican became nervous, squeezed his teeth, and his face was illuminated by an explosion of flames that soon crossed his body, followed by a deeper explosion. Juno thought that the explosion was a basic ability of Berserker. This was probably the first time Tahan used it completely. A Berserker loses control of himself in exchange for overwhelming power, so he probably had not used it before because it was difficult to manage the risk of the weapon breaking. Meanwhile, Tahan lowered his sword and stood still, then flames began to escape from his mouth, followed by a powerful explosion of energy that released all the fire. Then the flames gradually decreased, and he sighed thinking that he had been dangerous. If he had not released all his power, he would have lost his sanity. He looked at his trembling hand and thought that this was only the second time this had happened since his awakening. He had finally managed to use this ability correctly. Then he looked at Juno, thinking that he had made a mistake. Juno was not just a common awakening. Once his ability was discovered, everyone would focus on him. This thought worried him, and he decided to take another look at Erinc's destroyed body. The protagonist approached and also examined him, noticing the purple energy. He thought there was an incredible amount of mana, not even comparable to other dungeon bosses with a bug. He turned to Tahan and asked him if he felt anything from that corpse. Tahan replied that no, he was definitely dead. They had discarded his remains, so he was no longer alive. At that moment, the protagonist realized that not even a high-ranking hunter could perceive this mana, so he got closer. By doing so, his passive ability was activated and the aura began to flow into his body. His magic bar was completely filled and the system notified that 150 units of mana, a total of 100, had been accumulated. If the collected magic exceeded the limit, a reward would be awarded. He obtained a new ability, Production of Demonic Weapons. This was an active ability that consumed 100 units of accumulated mana to create weapons of the demonic kingdom. At that time, he did not have stored demonic weapons, These would be stored once created and could be materialized without using additional mana. He could use this ability once a day, and he thought that he could not even imagine that it would be a weapon of the demonic kingdom. Although he did not have memories of the demonic kingdom, it could be what he thought. He regretted that the reward was not related to mana, but this was not bad at all. His magic bar was restored to 50 units, and he thought that thanks to his reaction he had already obtained half of the required amount. It seemed that the reward ended there. Suddenly Tahan interrupted his thoughts, called him and told him that he had something to tell him. The protagonist turned to him, asking what was going on, and he replied that he wanted to apologize. He bowed to him and said that despite his negative, he had still insisted that he join the guild. It was rude of him, even as the leader of the guild. Juno, clearly not waiting for this, was slightly surprised, and the man closed his eyes and said that he really regretted it and wanted to apologize. The protagonist felt uncomfortable and asked what he was doing all of a sudden. At that moment, the team leader looked in his direction and nervously wondered what the hell was going on. Suddenly his thoughts were interrupted by the voice of the swordsman, which made him jump over and turn quickly. The man raised his hand with a smile and said that it was dangerous, that they had searched everywhere and there was nothing left there. The girl who was walking next to him shared her thoughts, saying that he must have absorbed all the monsters from the dungeon beforehand. The man looked at his sword disappearing and asked, "Is not this an incredible weapon? Can you cut monsters without wasting energy?" She agreed with his words and said that she had never heard of a blacksmith capable of doing something like that, so he asked if it was from the guild or Uberkill. Suddenly the team leader ran towards them and hugged them, nervous, urging them to leave so that he could contact the association. The men looked worried and confused. He asked why exactly they should leave. The girl agreed with him and said that she wanted to thank the guild master and the assistant first. The excited leader waved his hands and suggested that they quickly leave that disgusting place. At that moment, the swordsman looked confused and replied that they had already understood, so he had to stop insisting. After that, the team leader led them to the exit, taking a look at the rest of the team while he thought that despite the evident connection between this assistant and the guild or Uberkill, it would be best if they left. If they got involved in the affairs of an important guild, there would be no end to the problems. Juno stepped aside and agreed to speak, saying that although he had used the rental contract, the leader of the guild should not bow to someone he barely knew. Tahan said that the guild would no longer bother him, and of course, he would not do it either, but that statement did not mean that they had surrendered. This was his first opportunity. The protagonist crossed his arms on his chest, looking at him with distrust, but then Tahan extended his hand offering to make a contract, saying that he was sure that he would like the terms. A new day arrived, and the protagonist went to the building of the guild or Uberkill where he found Mino at the reception. She said she was happy to see him again and introduced herself. Today he would be responsible for managing the contract. Juno thanked him and said that the leader of the guild had mentioned that he would contact him immediately, but who was going to imagine that it would be the next morning. She replied that the leader had asked her to prepare everything as quickly as possible. He asked where they were now that they had arrived. She replied that this was the special reception room of Uberkill, a highly secure place, so she did not need to worry about privacy. Then he placed the contract on the table and asked him to read it. These were the conditions that the guild leader had mentioned in the dungeon. It would take a little time, but he could modify the content of the contract, so he should not hesitate to say what he thought. The protagonist picked up the contract and read it carefully. Then he thought with a smile that as he had said in the dungeon, now that everything was resolved, he felt more real. He put the contract back on the table and said that he had no questions and that they could proceed. While discussing the terms of the contract in the dungeon, Juno had been confused about the support of the guild, and Tahan clarified that it was not an official support, but a secret support. Of course, this was just speculation, but he vaguely understood why Tahan did not want him to join the guild, for several reasons. He needed to hide his identity. If he was in the right place, then his suggestion could help. They could secretly supply him with the materials he needed, equipment, ingredients, door rights. It did not matter, he just needed to sign a contract as a formality. Everything would be provided in secret. Of course, the protagonist asked why they were suddenly so generous. He replied that naturally, it was not just out of kindness. He would have to complete missions assigned personally to him. Those were his conditions, but he would not force him. If he did not like the missions, he could reject them. Juno laughed and asked what would happen if he did not help, but still received his support. He replied that it would be fine too. The main point of the contract was to create a bond between the guild and him, preventing him from joining others. Accepting the support was nothing more than a sign of his loyalty, that was all. Suddenly strong footsteps were heard nearby and they turned to the sound. The members of the association ran towards them and said that they were from the team of the Hunter Association. In that, one of them went to the guild master and asked him if he was okay. Realizing that it was time to go, Tahan told Juno that he would listen to his answer outside. He hoped that the answer would be affirmative. He finally turned around, and with a smile, he added that for him, his skill was the best. Reflecting on this, the protagonist picked up a pen and thought that according to his plan, he wanted to leave a lasting impression on Tahan and continue his relationship with the guild or overkill without joining her, but for now this would still be useful to him. So he signed his name and handed the document to Minu, asking when he would begin to receive support. She replied that from now on, she had to let him know if she needed something. She took a small box from her bag and placed it on the table, saying that the guildmaster had prepared a gift as a memory of the contract. He had heard that he had found something useful in Erang's room. Juno curiously opened the box and Mana began to filter. So he closed it and kept it in his backpack, thanking him with a smile. Then he gave him a list of the materials he currently needed and asked when he could receive them. She looked at the list and replied that there were many things, so she thought it would be possible in a week. However, maybe he was getting into something that did not concern him, but he felt that those materials would not be useful to him. Then, he got up from the sofa, put his backpack on his shoulders and replied that he would not use them, he just wanted to give them to another person. Time passed and he went to the Hunters Association to see someone. He took out his phone and verified the time, thinking that she should have arrived by now. When the girl entered the association, she smiled thinking that the lower-ranked hunter, Anya, had finally arrived. The girl, in doubt, walks towards the showman, but in her future memories, she had a completely different personality. When she fought monsters and shot arrows at them, creating huge holes in their bodies, she was very confident in her skills. After the players were selected, this great hunter was called the Now. Without raising his eyes from the ground, he approached the showman and turned to the attendant of the association, saying that he wanted to request a training pass for the door. He gave her his identification, and with a smile, he asked if, being a lower-ranked hunter, they should give him a pass for a C-rank door. She rejected him, and with a shy smile, she said that she would like to get a pass for the D-rank door, which surprised the attendant. The man looked at his information on the computer and saw that he had only entered the door twice. He thought she had recently been classified as a lower-ranked hunter, but considering that he had almost no experience and had only entered the door a few times, he had seen lower-ranked hunters give up first, but not lower-ranked ones. The guy quickly took a quick look at Anya, who was filling out the documents, and thought that she would probably have her reasons, but soon she would be degraded. The first rank of the awakened is based on the amount of mana. When the blue energy flows through the cracks, the mana enters all human beings, but each one absorbs a different amount. The more he could store the body, the better the skills of a person were. So the association began to calculate how much mana each person had. Those who could control more than a certain amount were called awakened and then began to classify them according to the amount of mana. Of course, the rank is not fixed. Even if the rank is low, a hunter can make raids in the dungeon, and if he gains fame within the association, he can be promoted. Of course, the opposite can also happen. At that moment, Anya gave the documents to the girl with a smile and said she had filled everything out. Offering her help with the registration, she asked her if she had a partner. The excited girl replied that she did not, and said that then she would register her on the list of according to the rules, it was necessary to make raids in groups of 2 people, so until now there had been no requests for the degradation door, so she would have to wait a while. Anya asked if she could go alone, to which the girl replied that yes, but only if she had permission to enter alone. However, considering that she was registering, she did not have that permission. To obtain it, she needed to pass the test. Anya got nervous and asked her to wait, then the girl said she needed to tell her something. In a month she would have a rank update. Anya, about to leave, was frozen when she heard those words, and the girl continued to say that she had probably already seen the message, but to confirm her rank A, she would need experience cleaning a dungeon of rank S or hiring or approving a rank A test. He thought the test would be more suitable for her. He would probably receive a message about it soon and hopes to be successful. Anya thanked her excitedly and then left the association, thinking that even asking for a pass for the training door was difficult, so she would have to make a request online. Coming to such a crowded place was crazy. He decided to come because he thought it would not be degraded. He recomposed and remembering his experience cleaning the dungeon, he thought it was a rank D door, so something like that would not happen again. If he did not hurry, everything would be fine. Suddenly a message arrived on his phone, and nervous, he adjusted his glasses thinking that they had told him that he would have to wait for an invitation, but it had already arrived. A new day came and he approached the rank D door, and he walked hesitantly towards the portal and thought that he had not dressed like that for a long time. It seemed so unusual to him. The protagonist, who had become his partner, approached and asked for his name, then introduced himself, saying that he hoped they would get along. Anya made a slight reverence and said that it was a pleasure to meet him. He smiled shyly, apologizing for arriving late. He got up and quickly she was excited and said that she had made a request and then spoke to the staff of the association. At that moment, he thought that she was a hunter who had originally been rank A, but after failing continuously in the tests, she was one of those who were degraded to rank C. Despite these conditions, he received the title of God Archer because after becoming a player, he discovered a talent within her, and he knew what kind of talent it was. It was a talent that could be discovered within oneself even without being a player, and today he wanted to awaken it in her. After that, they entered the dungeon and found themselves in a forest in the middle of the mountain, where the goblins wandered freely. A small group of goblins patrolled the area. Anya, who was hiding behind the bushes, spied discreetly and thought, have they gone? Are they really monsters? Thank goodness I decided to buy this. He looked at the bracelet and thought it was a team that detected the mana of the monsters. He turned to his partner and apologized, saying that he would go alone. He asked him if he could take care of the slaughter alone, promising to give him all the loot and compensate for everything. He knelt down in response and told him not to worry, that if he needed help, just let him know. At least, he could create arrows. She got up, thanked him, tensioned the arrow on the bowstring and pointed out, saying mentally that everything was fine, that she did not need to worry. Finding the right moment, he released the arrow, which left a magical glow in his step. Then he approached the goblin, and when he turned, the arrow hit his head. The second goblin moved quickly out of the attack line and grabbed his bow to shoot back. Behind them, there was an explosion caused by the arrow when it hit something. Pulling the bowstring again, Anya shot another arrow, but it failed. Juno, for his part, watched her and thought that he had never seen her fight before becoming a player. His brute destructive power was much greater than that of a rank A, but it was useless if he could not aim. At that moment, Anya shot another arrow and made a hole in the body of one of the monsters. Then he thought that one of the 3 arrows had hit the target. That was his record. In this way, he could kill at least 4 more monsters. He needed to finish everything with 2 shots. Just when he was about to shoot another arrow, he suddenly stopped to notice that one of the goblins was blowing a horn, warning the others about the danger. He did not immediately understand what that meant, but then the goblins appeared in the light, and feeling the pressure everywhere, he froze in his place. His bracelet beeped, warning about the danger, and when he looked around, he realized that he was surrounded. She was confused and nervously thought, where should I shoot? Forward or backward? What should I do? At that moment, the goblins behind her decided to attack, but suddenly an intense light appeared in front of her. Many swords crawled on the ground, stopping them so that they would not advance. Juno walked towards Anya, smiling and saying that she needed her help. She exclaimed surprised, asking if she had not said that she was a rank creator of him. He replied that yes, and then his sword began to dissolve. He said it wouldn't last long, so he needed his help. She turned to him and asked what she should do. He pointed to the monsters that were hiding behind the bushes and told her to shoot there with all her remaining strength. She accepted and pointed again, thinking that she did not know what she was planning, but she would do what she asked. After that, he shot an arrow that flew at the speed of light, destroying everything in its path. He warned his partner about the shot and asked him what to do next. He took his hand and told him that with his shot he had cleared the way, now they needed to run. At that moment, the monsters threw themselves at them, and she was very surprised to see him run from them while dragging her. Soon they distanced themselves from the monsters and found themselves at the entrance of a cave. Anya regained her breath and wiped the sweat off her face, saying that they had survived. Then he thought, where were they? And he wondered if they had gotten rid of the goblins. He remembered that while they were running through the forest he had looked back and had the feeling that they could no longer reach them. There really was something back there. So much had happened that I could not understand it. He looked at his partner, who was lighting the cave with a flashlight, and thought mentally, why is he so calm? They needed to get out of there quickly. She smiled shyly and said that she had already finished for that day, that she would pay the compensation that she had mentioned. He replied that they could not leave yet. They were worried, so they would stay there for a while. It was too dangerous now. It seemed that they had left a trail while they were running, so they had no choice but to wait for the goblins to move away. She exclaimed, when could they leave? Then he turned to her and replied that it could take half a day, but depending on the situation, it could take longer. Upon hearing this, she shuddered and then grabbed her head, exclaiming, half a day. Deciding that they were lost, he knelt in despair and he scratched the back of his head, thinking that of course, he was lying. They would be far away in about 30 minutes, and the focus of the goblins was not so strong. It was a pathetic reason, but at this point it seemed that Anya would believe anything. He looked again at the entrance to the cave, and thought that this was because he needed to force her to enter the cave with him. As he reflected on this, He closed his eyes and crossed his arms over his chest. Then he imagined seeing her run out of the cave in panic and thought he doubted that she would accept. Suddenly his thoughts were interrupted by Anya's guilty voice. She got up, made a small reverence and apologized, saying that all this was her fault. If I knew how to fight, if I had gone alone from the beginning, none of this would have happened. She felt terrible about all that. Nervous, she squeezed her gun with her hands and thought that once again, she had caused problems. Even in a ranged dungeon she was acting like that, desperate. She shouldn't even have tried it. He began to cry and squeezed his teeth, telling himself that he shouldn't have come. Juno extended her hand towards her and clapped her fingers in front of her face, distracting her from those thoughts. He said that if he felt guilty, then he would let her do something for him and that he needed her to recompose. She hesitated and asked what the request would be. He turned to the cave and said that they had a lot of time, then looked at her with a smile and added that he would explain everything in detail. After that, they entered the cave together and began to advance, illuminating the path with the flashlight. Anya hesitated and asked if she really needed his help. She was ranked, but she did not have much experience in dungeons and did not even understand what he meant by an elite monster. He smiled, remembering that he had said that this was his first time at a training door, and said that now he understood because he did not know. It was not a very common knowledge. Instead of bosses, in this dungeon there was an elite lower-ranked monster and he lived in that cave. For personal reasons, he needed to defeat that monster, but until now he had been rejected and had not even been able to fight him. That is why she was the first to accept him as support for her team. Hearing this, she shrugged and remained silent, and he looked at her, wondering if that sounded strange. Gathering his determination, she squeezed her lips and then stopped and said with confidence that he would help him if he did not care. Remembering the goblins in the forest, he thought that helping him was the right decision. Thanks to him, she had been saved and also knew how painful it was not to be accepted in a team. I needed to help him. Suddenly his bracelet emitted a whistle, and at that moment a loud sound was heard. He got nervous, and the protagonist illuminated the area in front of them. A huge goblin with a claw in his hand appeared before them. It was the elite monster. Anya immediately took a step forward and strained the rope of her bow, telling Juno to move away. Then he thought that although the monster was illuminated, he was still a monster of range, that if he hit him at least once, he would die. His arrow wrapped itself in magic chains and then shot it. Seeing that the arrow followed the correct trajectory, he was happy about his success, but suddenly the goblin covered himself with the claw and the arrow passed through him, leaving her stunned. With the impact, the goblin's leg slid backwards and she thought she deflected the arrow. She was wrong, she needed to shoot with all her strength. He tightened the rope again, but when he tried to release it, his body did not respond and his fingers refused to let go of the tip of the arrow. His hands trembled and he thought nervously, why now? He needed to shoot. Hearing the loud sound again, he focused his attention on the monster. Seeing him run towards them while he swung his claw, he froze in fear. Suddenly the protagonist grabbed her and threw her back, causing her to fall. Then he advanced. Just after that a loud noise was heard and dust rose. The monster had hit the ground with his claw with all his strength. Looking at the cloud of dust with confusion, he called Juno. He remembered being in the dungeon and finding himself in a similar situation. A girl from his team exclaimed, "What are you doing? Is this a joke to her? He can't even shoot correctly, and when he did, it was in his direction. He almost dies because of him. How is he going to make up for it?" Anya asked him to wait and said that although he had missed the target, he had not tried to shoot her. The girl smiled sarcastically and asked him angrily, "She does not apologize, but she makes excuses? Do you think that just because she is rank of the world is at her feet? Soon she will find out who she is messing with." After leaving the dungeon, Anya was rejected from the team and other hunters began to whisper asking if she was the rank a loser. They had heard that she almost kills someone in the dungeon and that she could not even kill a weak monster. Someone called her stupid and said that is why even the rank teams rejected her. Another hunter asked what he was doing with his talent. What a waste. If he was like that, why was he still a hunter? When leaving his memories, he looked at the monster with a dark expression and thought that he should have given up everything for his fault. Even Juno had been hurt. At that exact moment, the goblin raised his claw over his head, ready to hit, but suddenly a bright spark flew between them and Juno said that he was really bad at acting. His sword easily blocked the attack of the elite monster. Anya, realizing this, called him surprised, and he said loudly that he knew that it sounded senseless, but that he needed to listen to her carefully. If he calmed down and only did what he said, then they could definitely win. He flinched and thought that he had prepared everything in case of emergency. She could activate it without problems. All that was left was to win time. He continued to swing his sword attacking and told him to look at that fool well, who would see something and should hit that mark with all his strength. But Anya no longer listened to him. His body trembled and began to rise, wondering what that feeling was. His senses sharpened, he was very uncomfortable, but he could see everything. His eyes shone and the arrow tensed again, thinking that now he could clearly see where he was pointing. He drew the arrow, and concentrated completely, closed his eyes, and then opened them in pairs, thinking that with this single arrow everything would be solved. He pointed and released the arrow, which left a bright light in the air. The goblin froze in his place when he heard the whistle he emitted. The protagonist stated that fortunately, it seemed that everything had been activated correctly, but for some reason the activation conditions were very strict. Then the elite monster extended his claw towards the arrow to protect himself from the blow, but the arrow pierced both the weapon and the monster, leaving a large hole in his body. Seeing this, Juno smiled, thinking that it was worth it, while Anya was surprised and confused at the same time. Just after, an explosion occurred. The cut member of the monster fell to the ground due to the impact, and the creature itself began to lose its balance before finally collapsing. Anya kept nodding as the protagonist explained that at first she would feel strange. However, he said that he had probably never felt his senses amplified before. Even so, he had used some extreme methods for her to understand that feeling and be able to realize her potential. Despite that, Anya was still confused and asked how she knew all that was going to happen. She also asked him what he wanted to say with his potential. He smiled and told her to take his time, that they had a lot of him. She approached him, and with an irritated tone, asked him not to change the subject and answer the question. But before he could finish talking, he suddenly felt a sharp pain, grabbed his head and then lost consciousness. The protagonist had to carry her on his back to the exit signal, yawning and saying that making friends was really difficult, but at least one thing had been resolved. Just when they left the cave, she woke up and the first thing she did was apologize, saying that she did not know why she had acted like that she felt that she was not herself. She could not believe that he had shown such a lack of respect for the man who had saved her twice. She was really sorry for having doubted him and apologized for having passed out so suddenly. He was confused by his apology, then he touched his forehead with fatigue, saying that he was fine, that no one had been hurt and that they had defeated all the monsters, so we had to recover. The half an hour had already passed. She felt tears in her eyes, and he asked her if she could give him the pendant that he had given her before they entered the cave. She remembered and put her hand in her pocket and then gave it to him. He examined the pendant carefully and noticed that the color of the crystal had changed. She had definitely used it. The perception meteorite was a rare object that could only be obtained in the Ranghua dungeon called Nido de la Arpia Ardent. This object had a skill called Acute Senses, which was activated automatically when certain conditions were met. For example, when a person fired an arrow at the head of the bearer of this pendant, his senses became extremely acute, improving his abilities and allowing them to use superhuman perception. He returned the amulet to her and thought that the problem was in the difficult conditions for its activation. The emotions of the bearer had to be at their peak. For people like Anya, the best way to activate it was through intense fear, so he had made her feel unbearable fear. It seemed difficult, but he had managed to wake her up, although at a high price. There were very few of these pendants on the market, and he had already given up on getting one, but he thought that Tao would find it in 2 days, and thanks to him everything had become much easier. But this was just the beginning. Anya only felt that she was waking up by the object. She would need more practice to reach her original level. Her expression became serious and told her to listen carefully. Her first task was to make sure that her concentration was completely focused on the monsters. To do this, she first needed to change her bow. She was strong enough to go from a short bow to a long one and shoot at a natural distance. He would not need to fight the monsters up close, which would make her feel less afraid of them. He wanted to tell her something else, but she did not let him finish and simply thanked him. He did not understand why he thanked her, and she said that she was grateful for everything, including the pendant. When he thought he was going to die there, he felt something come from him, as if everything around him had frozen, as if he could do anything. He gave where he was aiming, and the objective was perfectly aligned with the monster. To be honest, although his character range was minor, in terms of everything else, it was nothing more than a D, and the more he tried to change that, the more disappointed he felt. But he had the feeling that during this short time together he had grown a lot. He felt that he was capable, that he could do anything, and for the first time he allowed himself to go with that. Realizing that he had said too much, he was worried, but he smiled and told him that it would not be easy for her alone, that he would give her his number so that she could call him if she needed something. She was very happy and thanked him. Then he said that he would also leave his number. When Jun was about to give him his number, he noticed a message from Tahan asking him to call him quickly because there was an emergency. He decided that he would contact him once they left the dungeon. After a while, as soon as he and Anya left the dungeon, he called Tahan, who thanked him and said that he would return the call after the meeting. Juno smiled and said that he would help if he could. The last time, Tan had given him something very useful. Tahan replied that he was happy that it would have been useful to him, and that he was happy that Juno had agreed to help him. After that, he hung up the phone, kept it in his pocket, and peeked out the window when he heard a knock on the door. Jesu entered the office and said that the president of the association had returned and that they could leave shortly. Shortly after, the two reached the building of the association and walked down the corridor, but Jesu was restless. He commented that the situation was very unusual, that he would normally have sent an official document. Who would have imagined that the president of the association would call him? He had been sending difficult orders through documents, but if he had called him personally, perhaps the range of the exit door would have appeared again. Tahan replied that he was fine, that Jano had agreed to help him, that if he fought as before there would be no danger. He thought with a satisfied smile that he had done well to establish a joint work relationship. Jesu, on the other hand, was worried, thinking that he seemed more excited than he was after the massacre of Tahan, probably everything for that creator. He had been acting strangely since the unlimited support. Who would have thought that the guild master would make such a surprising offer? She knew that the berserkers had difficulties to control their emotions, but the guild master was calculating and sensible. Could Juna be more capable than he had imagined? But he immediately discarded that idea, thinking that a range of I could not create a weapon that he really liked. He rarely invited him, so he needed to discover everything in person. Tahan noticed his suspicious look, and then the two reached the door of the president's office. The guard outside greeted him asking if he was alone. Tahan was a little surprised by the question and asked if someone else was supposed to come. The guard replied that according to what he had heard, 2 guild leaders were expected. If they were alone, he could wait. Tahan asked if he could know who the other leader was. The man noticed someone behind them, and then pointed forward with a smile, saying that he had already arrived. Jak, the leader of the Sigma Guild, appeared behind them, and when he noticed Tahan, he exclaimed, surprised to hear his voice. Tahan and his secretary immediately turned around, and Ak made them a greeting gesture, saying that he had heard that he had been very busy lately. Tahan remained silent as he whispered the sign, thinking that this was the only person that irritated the guild leader. He gave him a false smile and said that he did not expect to see him there. Tahan whispered the sign slightly, containing his anger. The guild master Sigma approached and asked who he was, and if he was not the silly guild leader or overkill, he declared Ao. Tahan remained silent, thinking about how annoying he was, making fun of Ao. He said he was wrong. After all, he was not the guild of the problem, he was the leader. Tahan said he was too busy to respond to his absurd provocations. Aok said he must be busy choosing low-level dungeons. He was consoling himself by making the newbies admire him. He made fun of him. Yunho did not like that and asked what he was trying to say. Aok stated that it seemed true, since he had not gone to those dungeons to save anyone. After all, he had tried to clean or rank a dungeon and was classified wrongly. She was surprised, and Tahan put a hand on his shoulder, telling him not to respond to that. She wanted to object, but she did not. He turned to the guard and said he would enter. Then he opened the doors and told the president of the association that the guild leaders were Overkill and Simua were already there. Manan replied that he already knew, that he could hear his discussions from there. He smiled and added that they never changed. Shortly after, both entered and Jesus remained outside. The guard looked at the girl sitting next to him, a little hesitant, and offered him tea, but she rejected him politely, saying she was fine. Meanwhile, the 2 guild leaders, Tahan and Aak, were sitting in front of Chamanan. He looked at them and said that there was an urgent task for his guilds that had to be completed immediately. 3 days ago, an unspecified door appeared on the outskirts of the city. Explorers were sent to investigate it, but none of them returned. Tahan frowned and asked if that door was a wrong door. Shamanan replied that, as I had already mentioned, the door was undefined and even measuring his mana was extremely difficult. Ayok exclaimed, confused, trying to understand the situation. Tahan thought it was strange that the door could not even be evaluated, since there were normally tools for that purpose. The range of a door was generally determined by 2 factors. First, the amount of mana inside the door using a special tool that allowed to determine the range of the door. Normally, the range of the door corresponded to the range of the monsters inside. Second, the intelligence data sent by the association to evaluate the situation were compared. Shemanan stated that as they already knew, the wrong range dungeons arose when the amount of mana inside increased suddenly. However, this time it was impossible to measure it. Tahan asked if they had tried to send more explorers, and he confirmed that they had done so several times, but none of the explorers returned. Aok placed his hands behind his head in frustration and asked irritated if they had no information about the range of the dungeon, or what it contained. Suspiciously he questioned if the association was trying to divert the blame from what happened. The president of the association replied by explaining that they did not know how long the Veil of the Unknown range door would last. If they did not act soon, it was very likely that the monsters would begin to leave the door. He reminded them that this had happened in the past, and that every time it happened, it became a total disaster. Then with a serious expression, he added that he understood how his words might seem overwhelming, but this was truly an emergency, and this time they would not accept rejections. He wanted the guilds or Uber-Killies to join forces to clean the undefined door. He would have liked to also send the guild to Lama, but they could not participate due to a sudden mission abroad. This case was serious enough to bring together the 3 largest guilds. He set a 2-day deadline for preparation, indicating that he would provide funding and the best possible reward for completing the mission. Of course, if they needed anything, he would assist them in everything possible. Reflecting on what he had said, Tahan asked if the cleaning team should consist only of guild members. Shamanan replied that it did not matter, since the existence of that door was causing chaos and panic in society. He could only allow a small number of reliable individuals to participate in the mission. Seeing Tahan's reaction, Aok looked at him with a slightly surprised expression. Tahan then smiled weakly, his confidence evident, and said he understood everything. After that, Aok returned to his guild, and throwing his jacket at a subordinate, ordered a team of guild members of rank A or higher to be gathered and selected those who would be available in the next 2 days. Remembering Tahan's smile, he thought that this kind guy definitely had something planned. What was that smile? It was so irritating. I would definitely take advantage of this opportunity to crush him. Annoyed, he ordered that Yurin Khan be included in the team, which surprised his subordinates, and insisted that she should be invited without fail. The subordinates, upon hearing the order, became nervous, surprised that the leader was demanding the presence of a girl who usually refused to help anyone. The excited girl said that given her personality, she would definitely refuse, to which Aok replied sharply that they should do everything possible to ensure that she would appear, and warned that if she did not, they should be prepared to change roles. The members of the guild, scared, quickly confirmed their understanding and dispersed to carry out the order. Even with frustration, Aok headed to the elevator thinking that Yurin Khan normally did not help anyone, but he planned to take advantage of the situation and recruit her. 2 days later, the first part of the team, made up of members of the guild or Uberkill, met at the door. A girl named Jane asked what time it was, since the others had not yet arrived. A classman said that there were 5 minutes left until the scheduled time for the meeting. They were always punctual. Expressing his displeasure clearly, he turned his weapon in his hand and said that he could not stand those fools. They did not have manners. His expression hardened and he asked if they would learn something if he shot them in the head. The man, outraged by his words, hit him on the head, telling him to be careful with what he said. She grabbed her head in pain and said that he was brutally strong. He approached her in a threatening way and asked what he had said. After that, she began to run and he chased her. Juno, watching the scene, told Tahan that the members of his guild were doing very well. Tahan replied that although it seemed like that, they were very reliable in battle. He was grateful that Juno had accepted. To be honest, he thought he would deny it. The protagonist smiled lightly and said that he had used the item that Tahan had given him. He was also proud of it. Directing his attention to the members of the guild who had already begun to fight, he thought that of course, this was not the only reason. He had a secret mission that would be carried out in a dungeon with a story. There he needed to put an end to the abandoned world and receive rewards. The opening time of the dungeon was 168 hours. In addition, the mission window had unknown coordinates and rewards written on it. 5 days ago, this system window with a secret mission, something that only a small number of players received, had suddenly appeared before him. The selection of players had not yet begun, but I had already received this secret mission, so I did not see any reason to reject it. Although these missions had very high levels of difficulty, if he completed them he could receive incredible rewards, some even awaken new skills. Who would have thought that it would be the same dungeon? Sol Tahan distracted him from his thoughts and looked at him, finding his serious look. He apologized in advance for the rudeness of that fool, and then he heard the voice of I saying that they arrived a little early. The vice leader and how he immediately stopped fighting. Tahan took a step forward while apologizing to them, saying that they had a lot of work. They understood that, but it seemed that the guild or Uberkill had too much free time. Upon arriving at the meeting place with his team, he said with a sarcastic smile that they had been clearing low-ranking doors. Because of that, Hai got very angry, but the man who stopped her asked him not to respond and to ignore them. She wanted to object, and was about to insult them, but he silenced her immediately and asked her again to ignore them. At that moment, Juno stood at a certain distance, thinking that the guilds Uberkill and Sinnoh were still in bad terms. It was not only an emotional rivalry between the guilds, but also a public dispute over which one was stronger. Io, noticing a new face among the members of Uberkill, observed Jonio, and laughed, asking if it was his trump C. Then he declared that they had acted as if they had something, but in the end it was only him. His laughter turned into anger and he sighed heavily, saying that they had gone too far. Clearing the dungeon was a joke for them, they wanted to be taken out of there? The protagonist remained silent and called them fools. A girl from his team smiled and asked him to stop getting angry, saying that they also had a new member on their team. A girl named Kieran appeared behind them, and with a discontented expression reminded them that they had said that they were short on time. I didn't think they had time to argue, so they needed to hurry. He took a step forward, and Janelle, seeing her, retreated horrified, asking what type of composition was this. The strongest elementary teacher in Korea, capable of using the 6 elements, Kang Guren, a S-rank sorceress, Kim Ha-ak, and her guild leader, Yoon Tae-han. Did they really have such a stellar team? She remained silent about Juno, as she did not know his skills. Then he sighed with a smile and said it would be easy, she would be delighted to take care of all this. After that, they went to the door and Juno thought it would not be easy. In his previous life, the attempt to clear this dungeon had failed. The 18 members, only Yoon Tae-han had survived, mainly due to his infiltration ability. After that, the doors disappeared suddenly, being an unprecedented case in which all those of high rank among the awake were declared missing. The association worked tirelessly to find some information, but nothing was discovered about the dungeon. There was no guarantee that they would be successful this time, but after being in the dungeon for a while, everything turned out to be the opposite of what they expected. Their opponents, the dolls, were so weak that the battle was incredibly easy for them. This made Juno nervous, who wondered why everything was so easy. Some time before, a portal with a bright ring had lit up at the main entrance of the dungeon. He commented that the mansion was really great and the monk asked him to shut up. The whole team walked inside the dungeon when the monk heard a strange sound coming from the portal and turned around. There he saw the door closing violently and the others turned when they heard the sound. He tried to open the door but nothing happened, so he suggested knocking it down. The man shouted that he wanted to destroy the door and then they began to try to go through it. He counted out loud from 1 to 3 and the others hit the door hard. They were surprised and asked what was going on since the door didn't even move. Unsatisfied, the man asked everyone to move away because he would do it himself. However, he did not have time to try, since at that moment strange noises were heard behind him. He turned around and saw several creepy dolls. He attacked them, wondering what those creatures were. With his blow, the dolls broke into parts of the body, and the rest of the team also began to fight the monsters. Their attacks were especially powerful, and he wondered how those creatures dared to attack them when they were so weak. A girl called him, telling him that he could use his ability, however he replied that he was fine, that it was not necessary to use a skill for something so trivial. But shortly after, the girls shouted for the leader to turn around, because the monsters were reanimating behind him. The dolls began to reassemble their bodies with the help of mana. He smiled maliciously, noticing that his resurrection skill was activating. At least, that skill would be interesting to see, so he threw a punch and 2 huge manifestations appeared on his side. The dolls continued their attack, but he began to hit them fiercely, beating them with his magic fists, which caught them between the blows. The rest of the team also fought the monsters using guns. Juno Yen, from Joda's team, killed the dolls by cutting them into pieces with his spear. At that moment, only Juno and Yurin remained on the sidelines. He asked him if he was not going to fight, but Yurin asked him the same question. He explained that it was only a support. Yurin said that it was not necessary for her to fight, that he did not want to make an effort for a team like that. He observed the powerful flames unleashed by Tahan, who swung his flaming sword, setting the dolls on fire as they melted. Yurin said that he was interested in seeing the strongest awakening of Korea in action. He was not impressed by the fire of the guild leader and commented that they all seemed ordinary, they could not even kill a single monster. If he had known that this would happen, he would have rejected the mission. At that moment, Juno looked at the dolls and their shiny threads. He found the contaminated man strange and those monsters were not in their usual form. He noticed that each movement of the dolls was accompanied by a movement of the threads. When looking at the ceiling, he saw the source of the threads, all the mana was connected to that artifact. He just had to destroy the object, but he did not want to reveal his true skills. Then he thought he could use the agreement and that everything would be fine. He did not have time to act because he was distracted by Yurin, who killed a nearby insect using a magic crystal. The protagonist looked closely and asked him if he had enough mana to use on insects, because he did not use it to attack the threads above. She pointed to the fly and asked if he had not already given the reason. The insect was incinerated in a swarm of lightning, and Yurin replied that he killed whoever he wanted. Juno thought, looking at the ashes of the insect, that perhaps it was not necessary to investigate further. He began to create something and said that perhaps Yurin feared insects. After making that assumption, he began to form something with Mana. She replied that she was not afraid of those things, and that she should also stop talking to him because he was bothering her. Juno apologized and said that he did not want to interfere, but there was also an insect up there. He created a shield with a spider next to it. Yurin said that was irritating and prepared to attack with fire. Jode immediately withdrew the shield and she unleashed a huge and powerful stream of fire on the thread mass. A gigantic fireball destroyed everything and Yurin was confused. One of the dolls stopped moving and at that moment, Ioka attacked another doll. Then he thought, why was that annoying Yurin using his skills there? But suddenly he felt something strange and looked at the doll. He raised it over his head and asked what was happening, because they were not resurrecting anymore. Annoyed, he squeezed the monster's head and said that it had finally warmed up. But in the end, the weak monsters could not do anything. The wall broke and shone with intense mana. Juno walks towards her and began to absorb the mana. He realized that that was the source of the resurrection of the dolls. If he had not noticed the contaminated mana, he would never have found the origin. So he assumed that that could have been the reason why the cleaning of the dungeon had gone so badly. Tahan stood in front of a mountain of dolls, their bodies in pieces, and said that they were already finished, but since they still did not know everything they needed, they would have to register the entire first floor. The man with glasses said he understood and asked everyone to follow him. He ran forward and knocked down the door with his body, but Ahak overtook him. He shouted for everyone to move away because he would be the first. There were more dolls in the room and Ahak began to hit them. The protagonist looked around the room and thought, the contaminated mana is gathering in that closet? He pointed to the closet and asked Joy if she could shoot him. She did not understand at first, but then she decided to follow his advice. When he shot, the weapon broke into pieces. Everyone was surprised. Mangjin did not understand what was happening or why everything died so suddenly, and JWE tried to distract him. Then they went through all the rooms and managed to finish the first floor quickly. Tahan was the first to go up to the second floor and said that since they had already cleaned the first floor, they could proceed. Ijok, dissatisfied, said that he already knew that it was time to stop acting like the leader. Tahan turned around and did not respond, but led Mangjin and Hao forward. She smiled and turned the weapon in her hand, saying it was a beautiful thing, and Mangjin looked at her enthusiastically. Ijok was furious. At that moment he thought that Tahan had decided to ignore him. How irritating, he wanted to crush his pride. Suddenly he felt something unpleasant and looked at his palm. He did not understand what was happening, something had hurt him for a second. He had hurt himself. However, he ordered his team to advance. Iran said he would go with the leader and there was a ladder with a strange inclination. Juno watched them, which worried him, because according to Tahan, there was nothing special there. He said he would separate from the team and enter one of the rooms to check all the same. It was dusty and dark, he covered his nose and soon he saw many threads with an aura infected on the ground. He was surprised to see so much mana, but suddenly a loud noise was heard. At that moment, Hawk was ferociously fighting the monsters. He shouted that he did not have time to use a skill. The other team members were fighting the monsters with the same courage and fury. They shot and tried to cut the monsters into pieces, but nothing worked. Tahan kept his position and deflected the blows of the monsters with his sword. He asked if everything was okay. He realized that they were being attacked by an invisible high-level monster. Mangjin shouted that he was fine. Joda, who was close, said that she was also fine, but could not see the boy who had been with her. He asked him excitedly and began to look around the room. It was as if he saw the movement of each person. He began to worry because he had not noticed that Juno was missing. He began to scream and call him. At that moment, the protagonist was near the source of the contaminated mana and heard a scream. He realized that the battle was becoming more difficult, but he had already absorbed the mana, so he needed to hurry. Suddenly a hidden passage opened before him. He looked down to a dark basement. The protagonist thought, there will be enemies down there, but he decided not to turn the matter too much and began to descend. A figure began to appear before him and was surprised to see that it was a child. He wondered what a child was doing there. The girl, seeing him, smiled immediately. He began to walk towards him and asked him if he was a hunter. He did not wait for an answer, telling him to follow her, and then he ran down the stairs. Juno extended her hand and shouted for the girl to wait a moment. How did she know he was a hunter? The girl replied that her sister from above had told her that a hunter would come to save her, and that if that happened, they should go together. He asked if Juno had come here because he was the hunter who came to save his sister. He, surprised, asked him who his sister was. The girl asked him how his brother did not know her, which seemed strange to him, since he was sure he was talking about her. They went down and saw a girl sitting there. She had a strange and creepy appearance. The girl said that they had already arrived, that was the person she had been talking about. The protagonist looked at the surprised girl and thought that she seemed to have suffered a psychological trauma for some reason. He apologized, saying that the Hunter Association had sent him. She asked again if he was from the Hunter Association, if they had really sent him. The protagonist replied that yes. He knew that this could be confusing, but he asked her to tell him what had happened. She fell to the ground of relief and said that she thanked God, that she was very grateful. Then the sad girl began to tell her story. She was the fourth explorer to enter that dungeon. The first three did not return, so she was ordered to explore it. However, as soon as she entered, the dolls threw themselves at her from all sides. They surprised her and she tried to escape through the door, but for some reason it closed and did not open. She was trapped. He remembered how they had entered the dungeon, and realized that she had been in the same situation. He asked her if he knew what had happened to the other explorers. The girl replied that yes, she had called them at the entrance to check, but something seemed strange. It was as if they were not aware. They had a strange aura and looked terrifying. Her former teammates tried to attack her. She managed to escape and finally found this girl. Although she was trapped, this girl had helped her a lot. The little girl said it was true, that her sister played a lot with her. Juno asked what the girl's name was. She replied that her name was Elizabeth, but she could call her Beth. Then he said it would be better if they were together, since it was too dangerous to be alone there. The girl said it was dangerous inside, but she thought that outside it was much more dangerous.